Thank you for coming down today. We have Clarence Goodman, who is a self-styled entertainer and historian whose actual and literal travels have taken him all over the map and all over the place. His love for his hometown and eventual return to it have proven to be a blessing, as his efforts have made him a favorite of libraries, historical societies, radio, television, and film. And he joins us now with one of his more than 30 presentations.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody out there. And oh, yes. Keep clap, please, for my friends here. Ladies, my new best friend, the owl. This remarkable invention will be recording us, broadcasting us, and listening to us, and sending everything to the American government, looking for treasonous words. So it was nice knowing all of you. All kidding aside, thank you so much for coming along. And indeed, welcome, my friends, to Emancipation, to Inauguration, Chicago's Black experience, where we are going to, in a very chronological and linear way, scratch the surface of the impactful people, places, and events that contribute to Chicago's Black history. And all of these things, I hope you will find just another chapter of our shared American narrative. The most important thing I'm gonna say tonight, if you have a phone, and that's all y'all, silence those phones. This fake charm will evaporate if I am interrupted in a moment of brilliance by somebody's ringtone. That's the first of the bad jokes. And speaking of bad jokes, please, baby, please hold your questions and comments till the end of our time tonight. My buddies Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali, and Mr. Sam Cooke would appreciate it as well. And my friends, all of the images and many of the bad jokes I'm using tonight, I use within the fair use parameters of the American copyright laws. I'm Clarence Goodman. Here we go. It all starts with one, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. Some century and a half after the first non-indigenous people kind of came through, looked around and said, "Oh, we could make a city here. And from this city, we would dominate the continent." These, of course, Father Marquette and Louis Joliet. A century and a half after the legend of Chicago or Chicago spread through the French-speaking quarters, or the French Quarter, of North America, they reached the ears of Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, who said, "Man, I'm sick of Cincinnati. I can't get any barbecue up in here. I'm gonna head to Chicago and I'm gonna invent Chicago." So he arrives at the junction of the River Chicago and Lake Michigan. This river was at the time called Chicago or Chicago, and he comes up with a settlement. And this was 1790, and very, very quickly, within a couple of decades, Chicago becomes Chicago, and Chicago gets incorporated as a town in 1833 with 400 people. Wow, that is so much. But you know what the big deal was? We're right in smack dab in the middle of the critical part of the 19th century. Let me introduce you to slavery. Actually, you already met slavery, and presumably none of you like it. Slavery was the issue, the main issue on the table with our young nation. How does Chicago fit into this? Because of Chicago's proximity to the north, and that it was in a quasi-free area that, enjoyed an extradition treaty with most southern states if escaped slaves would be caught. They don't teach you that in history class, do they? Like most states say, yeah, that's your property. You can take them back. Don't expect any help from us. And so because of this, Chicago becomes part of the lack of advancement with the remote here. There we go. The legendary skinny thumb, skinny button, the legendary Underground Railroad. Indeed, as all of you know, the Underground Railroad, the means by which enslaved people would escape slavery in the southern states. When I was a youngster, I thought it was actually a line of the L system. And then they stood down there with their transfers waiting for a train from Alabama up to the north. But all kidding aside, Chicago becomes automatically a station, or I should say, a host of a gazillion stations in the Underground Railroad, with regard not only to Chicago being the final destination, if you will, for escaped enslaved people, but a lot of people who heard that America didn't treat Black people particularly well. Sure, okay. And they would just catch a breath, catch a bite to eat, catch some sleep, and head on up into Canada, because then is now Canada a much more humane society. Yes, Zoomland, I said it, than this one that we reside in. However, this advent of the Underground Railroads gives us a legion of superheroes. Good evening and welcome. No, you don't have to be sorry. You missed all the fun though.
Oh, I
You missed all the fun. I want you to meet our first impactful person, Mr. John Jones. Now, not only was he a tailor in downtown Chicago, and I think he holds the copyright on lamb chop sideburns as well. That's what I aspire to. Mr. Jones was a light-skinned African-American fellow whose tailor shop was in downtown Chicago. Now, by day, fitting people for suits, sir, I'm sorry, you need to wear pinstripes. You look much slimmer and much taller if we fit you. But by night, his tailor shop served as a station for the Underground Railroad. And this typified all of the angels throughout this land of ours, irrespective of race, irrespective of gender, irrespective of religion, who took their own lives, their own liberty in their hands by helping so many people out. And this was great. Mr. John Jones, the first of our important persons, the first of our important sites. This is the second edition of the Quinn Chapel AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the first all-Black church established in Chicago as far back as 1847. The first one burnt down in a fire that you might have heard of down the line, which we're going to get to. But this, my friends, is the second installment. You're looking up at a picture of the second installment, and it is still there. As one enters Bronzeville via Michigan Avenue going south, before you get into Bronzeville proper, you pass by this beautiful, beautiful church. And you can hear the history coming out of it. And then just around the corner, you have the last physical headquarters for the Chicago Defender. Oh, accidental foreshadow. I'm so sorry. 1847, this is established. What else is going on? Another place is established. Cook County Hospital opens up in 1857. Some of you recognize this from the picture, The Fugitive, with Chicago's own Harrison Ford. But this is important. The building is still there. It now belongs in part to the Hyatt Company, or that is the Pritzkers. This is where Governor Pritzker lives. I'm kidding. He does not live there. It's a building that is now a Hyatt, and it's also a food court, and all things having to do with the incredible arena, battleship row of clinics and hospitals and so forth over there in the near Chicago west side. But this is important because this building, Cook County Hospital, was the definitive free hospital in Cook County from the moment it opened until it shut down as a hospital. And as a result, the plurality, if not majority, of African Americans were born there between 1857 and about 1980. And when you think of all the impactful African Americans who call Chi-Town home, except for me, it is really, really important, everybody. That was a joke. If you don't laugh enough at my jokes, I'm going to say, ladies, that was a joke. Clearly, I'm not that important. I was born at Mount Sinai Hospital, about a quarter of a mile away. But this is important because almost anybody that you can find, many of them whom have left us, this is where they were born. A very, very big deal. The birthplace of something else. Wait, before you guys start throwing your shoes. The original Republican Party, as I dare say God intended it, was born not far from Chicago, and it was born almost strictly on the edifice of the abolitionment of slavery. This radical party was the wildest and most progressive thing ever in the United States today. And as a result of this being born in the middle of the 19th century and Chicago starting to explode so nearby in the middle of the 19th century, they had this symbiotic relationship. You wouldn't believe that today. Chicago grows, the Republican Party grows, Chicago grows, it starts to feed the kingmakers and the people who are absolutely going to benefit the Republican Party. we're looking at an important place that's no longer there. So this is where I was born. This is Mount Sinai Hospital. No, this is the Tremont Hotel, which was in the Loop proper, the northernmost part of the Loop at the corner of Dearborn Street and Lake Street. So if you're getting ready to walk out of the theater district, and there is the Nederlander Theater and there's the Goodman Theater, no relation, sadly, that is where the Tremont House was. Tremont House was owned by the family of Ira Couch, just like the piece of furniture. Ira Couch's family loaded. Their family is the only one still born in Lincoln Park, where the old cemetery used to be, because it's a huge mausoleum. That's why it says Couch. It's not inviting you to sit down on it. It's the name of the family. Ira Couch was a big time GOP dude and a kingmaker, and he funneled all kinds of money into the Republican Party as it grew because they saw an opportunity. Let's help take down slavery. This country's got to do the right thing. And so the Republican Party grows so quickly that in 1860, they have their national convention in Chicago, US of A, at the Wigwam. If you were driving by on Wacker Drive, the place known as Wolf Point, look across the street and there's the Merchandise Mart. You can barely see it now because it's surrounded by new skyscrapers, but you were standing precisely or approximately where the Wigwam was. And if you're lucky, you'll see the placard that says, here in 1860, this man was nominated for the presidency for the first time.
Wow.
Wow. Wow, indeed. Now that you've said wow, my work here is done. Good night and God bless you. Abraham Lincoln comes to Chicago beginning in 1847, and he is clean shaven, as you can see. And this man, in many ways, personifies the original Republican Party because he is the first Republican president of the United States, and he has not grown that very famous playoff beard yet. He does not grow that until after he is elected in 1860. And this man becomes one of the first presidents elected without a majority of the popular vote or the electorate, because so many dudes were running for president, including Chicago's own Stephen Douglas, that Lincoln kind of creeps in, wins, and then tightens his seatbelt because it's going to be a bumpy night. What a dump. Sorry. The Betty Davis impression is out. Abraham Lincoln slides into Washington, D.C., avoiding assassination attempts and kidnapping attempts, courtesy of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, headquartered in Chicago, USA, across the street from the Tremont House. Oh, what a coincidence. Abraham Lincoln gets to Washington and he says, buckle up, everybody's going to be rough, because he knows a war is going to come along, and he understands he is an unprecedented president because he is going to wage America's first total war. And he realizes the total war means utilizing all of your resources, which in the American experience hitherto had never included Black troops in mass. And indeed, the 29th Infantry Division out of Chicago, Chi-Town, Southside, is formed. Yes, whoa, indeed. And Abraham Lincoln is not above using the enslaved, the escaped slaves, as well as the freemen, even though at the beginning of the war, he has no intention of ending slavery. He only decides to end slavery from a position of power, and after having Frederick Douglass whispering in his ear for about 3.5 years. But this is important. Now, there's still, the war's going on, but we still got regular playing folk too. Meet Mr. Joseph Hutton, who was a guard and a watchman at the Chicago Board of Trade. The Chicago Board of Trade building back in those days was roughly at the corner of Washington and La Salle. He and his good wife, Anna Elizabeth Hudlin, were also angels. They lived in a house, they shared a house in Bronzeville, and while she was working as a domestic, he was working at the Board of Trade, they used their house to help people when it came to the Underground Railroad. So more wonderful, wonderful angelic activity courtesy of African Americans in Chicago. But wait a minute. The war ends, hurrah. But Chicago is a boom town. At the end of the Civil War, Chicago has grown from about people in 1833 to over a million by 1865. And it is the worst planned city ever. It's a boom town waiting for something bad to happen. And here it happened.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, the Great Chicago Fire, and that's saying something because Chicago has hosted a lot of fires and a lot of tragedies. This thing goes down starting October 8th, 1871, and it tears up a third of the city, displaces a third of the population, only kills about 400 people, but it tears everything hither and throws everything thither. However, you get a whole lot of stuff out of it. One, the slate is clean and the architects roll in and they're going to rebuild. Here's another one of our stories. You remember Joseph Hudlin, he of the Board of Trade? He and his wife on their way to getting out of town, and they see that the fire, which had originally been moving towards the west, the wind shifts and it starts coming north, heading for downtown. Watch out for those potholes. And he stops. He says, good wife, shag yourself on out of here. I got to stop at work for a minute. He goes into the Board of Trade building. And this is when Chicago is the stacker of wheat, the capital of all things or most things, agriculturally speaking, in this country. He gathers all of the records that he can get his hands on and takes them down into the sub basement to protect them. To this day, the Chicago Board of Trade not only considers him a hero, but they have a picture of him up in their gallery of great rich people. I guarantee you, he was the coolest one compared to all of those people. Joseph Hudlin, the city of Chicago, burnt down. How you gonna keep them down on the farm once they've fallen in a pothole in Chicago? So, Chicago is feverishly rebuilding in the first 2 decades after the Great Fire. And all kinds of people are flooding in. Chicago burnt down. It's better than ever. Meet Ida B. Wells. In my house, she is known as Miss Ida B. Frickin' Wells. Arguably one of the most important Chicagoans ever. Arguably one of the most wonderful and heartfelt with regard to her sincerity and her passion and her tenacity when it came to being a champion of civil liberties and things of this nature. She had already lived quite a life by the time she got to Chicago in 1892. She had been a teacher in Tennessee, in Memphis, Tennessee. She had gotten all of her younger siblings through college after their parents had passed away. She arrives in Memphis, Tennessee. She's a teacher. She gets thrown off of a train in Memphis, Tennessee because she didn't give her seat up to a white person. Accidental foreshadowing. Not only did she say, heck no, she bit the conductor on her way being thrown off the train. Now, that's a woman after my own heart. No, she had a really good dentist. She got thrown in jail. She sued the railroad, won. And then the threats start raining down from the KKK and all manner of white supremacists trying to intimidate. So she said, well, I'm only 4'11", so I'm really scared. So she moves to Chicago because she knows that this is the biggest platform for everything that she is going to do. And she is one of the eventually uncredited founding members of the NAACP. She is a suffragette. She is a champion of civil disobedience. And if you don't know anything about Ida B. Wells, you're in a library, you can find a bunch of stuff. I had the shirt that I wore in my car, which is now sweaty and everything, and it's up on my backseat, is an Ida B. Wells t-shirt. So I don't wear images of anybody unless I'm handsomely compensated or somebody I really, really admire. Ida B. Wells. But you know about her? Do you know about Lucy Parsons? Lucy Parsons, a woman of color, a woman of mystery. Who knows anything about her? I can only piece together so much. Most biographies have big question marks, but we do know this. She and her husband, Albert Parsons, a former Confederate soldier, moved to Chicago from Texas, and they were radical Republicans. He only fought for the Confederacy because he was from Texas. They come to Chicago because they're both radicals, they're both liberals, they're both progressives, they're both anarchists. Oh, I love them both. They came to Chicago when they wrote, they demonstrated, they preached, they marched, they made speeches, and then Albert Parsons gets wound up, tangled up in the Haymarket demonstration, which becomes the Haymarket riot. He's implicated and hanged eventually for that. Lucy Parsons, rather than take her two children back to Texas and carry on there, take them back to mother, she picks up her husband's baton. She already has her own because she was already thought to be too much of a radical, to be an ideal woman. And she demonstrates, and she uses the rest of her life as her platform. No less of a two-fisted macho writer, progressive writer than Studs Terkel said that he used to go to Bughouse Square in the River North area to listen to her speak when he was a little boy, and that inspired him to be a pain in everybody's backsides. And I love pains in the backside. Speaking of pains in the backside, if you had one, you could have gone to Providence Hospital, which opened up in 1891. Why? The first integrated hospital in American history opens up on the south side of Chicago in Washington Park. That is it. That building is still there, though it is dwarfed by what Providence Hospital has grown into. Not bad, 1891. What more have we got? We have this. Meet Daniel Hale Williams. Some of you are nodding. Yeah, you know that this African-American surgeon at Providence Hospital performed the first successful open heart surgery in the history of America. That is something. What else we got going here? Father Augustus Tolton. This man comes to Chi-Town from the deep south. His name was Gus Tolton, and he was a sweetheart of a guy. And he, excuse me, he was a very, very pious man, and he fell in with the teachings and so forth of the Roman Catholic Church, and then he finally converted. And then he, through his good deeds and so forth, he actually got ordained. So Gus Tolton becomes Father Augustus Tolton, and he was known all over Bronzeville as Father Gus until he passed away at a very early age. But I'll let you know a little something. This gentleman is on the fast track to canonization. So my friends, I present Saint Augustus Tolton. Chokes me up a little bit every time you say that. And wasn't he kidding? I mean, you know, Q gets into a lot of doors in this country. There were no more doors in the world than all of the doors that were opened in 1893 to celebrate Columbus's rather dubious legendary arrival in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, this was the occasion of the World's Columbian Exposition, the fabled World's Fair of 1893, hosted by Chicago, a celebration for which they expected 10 million people to come through Chicago. 27 million people at least came through Chicago at a time, when the population of the United States was only 64 million people. Wow. This was going to be an opportunity for everybody to celebrate the Western Hemisphere, North America, little of this, little of that, except African Americans were forbidden from exhibiting all that we had achieved since the end of slavery. Well, they hadn't met Ida B. Wells. B. Wells says, oh, hell no. And she organizes a boycott. Oh. And you want to see a man get scared. A man who owns a business back in those days gets scared. You say boycott. And suddenly, we will happily accommodate you colored folk. We'll give you one day, and we'll call it Colored People's Day. Ida B. Wells shockingly agreed to this. She was probably cursing and everything, and everybody said, this is the best we can do. So the nation of Haiti graciously gave us their pavilion to use for this one day. There it is, the Haitian Pavilion. You've all been to the Museum of Science and Industry, and you've stood at the Columbia Basin. If you're looking south from the Columbia Basin, and there is Lakeshore DeSable Drive, there's the point. also known as Promontory Point. The point, that is where the Haitian Pavilion was, just on the Lakeshore Drive side of that. If you're looking towards the Lake Michigan shoreline there. Yeah, and so there was a Congress of Africa. Not only did the nation of Haiti surrender and share with us, African Americans, their exhibit space, but they invited representatives of the African American community to participate in this unprecedented Congress of Africa. And this was basically all kinds of African nations getting together to talk shop and to talk about colonialism and what was going to go on with it. This predates and really is a precursor to the Bandung Conference of 1955, which Malcolm X would talk about in a lot of his speeches, which was colored people of all over the world coming together to talk about the ending of colonialism. Now, the main speaker at Colored People's Day, I should have advanced. The main speaker at this was Frederick Douglass at the Haitian Pavilion, and he was the most renowned African-American speaker at the time. Ida B. Wells went to him for counsel. How do I get white people to care about the fact that blacks are lynched for no good reason all the time? It hadn't even taken on the name yet of Jim Crow, this particular era. Frederick Douglass tells her, treat this nation like you would a teenager. Peer pressure. Go to Europe and tell the truth on America to her European sisters. And believe me, they will start to put pressure on America. And believe me, this happened. And suddenly, some public opinion starts to change because of Ida B. Wells's efforts there. Now, not only was there a lot of big talk and Ida B. Wells being talked out of biting more people as a form of protest, although I'm all for it, there were all manner of exhibition and performance when it came to African-American traditional colleges and universities, when it came to mathematics, music, science, and all things. I want you to meet the Hampton University Choir. They came, like so many people who showed up, this was their first trip to Chi-Town. They came, they sang, tra-la, tra-la, and then they explored the city of Chicago. And they said, this is a great town. We got a black neighborhood already for us. Gee, if we all moved to Chicago almost around the same time, I wonder what we do. Now, I don't think this is going to work on the screen. No, it doesn't. Oh, owl. Yep. This gentleman's name was Robert Abbott. He came, tra-la, he saw, and then he explored Bronzeville. And he said, oh yeah, get busy in Bronzeville. This is all right. I'm coming back up in here, foreshadowing. The World's Fair gives us the appearance of so wonderful image. This, my friends, obviously Aunt Jemima Pancake Flower, and the character herself, as played by Nancy Green, introduced at the World's Fair. Now, from the perspective of our postmodern sensibilities, but this was perfectly acceptable then, and the only reason I'm including, well, the main reason I'm including it is because we're using this as a point of reference, and we can see how things have evolved by the end of our time tonight. So everybody, do a screensaver in your mind's eyes, as if you need one, and we'll carry on. Musicians by the gazillion started coming to Chicago. Why? Because there's 27 million people there. It's got to be a gig. Hello. One of them was Scott Joplin, from Linden, Texas, through St. Louis up to Chi-Town. And he says, oh man, not only can I play a gig, but I can start crafting the finishing touches on a new subgenre to a new genre. The genre, jazz. The new subgenre, ragtime. You can make the argument that Scott Joplin comes to Chi-Town and invents ragtime. How wonderful. Another dude who comes to Chicago in time for the World's Fair, although I doubt if he was referred to as a dude, Mr. Dude, perhaps. Mr. Jesse Vega, notice, Mr. Jesse Vega, a former Pullman porter and a barber, arrives in Chicago 1892 with $10 in his pocket. Within 15 years, he's parlayed this $10 into a multi-million-dollar empire built on banking and real estate. All for the growth of the African-American experience and also Bronzeville. His home is a regional landmark there in Washington Park. It's right around the corner from the DuSable Museum, in case you want to go there sometime. Call first, because they have a lot of people traveling in. It's a joke, everybody. Jesse Bingham. The Pekin Theater. Shortly after the turn of the last century, the Pekin Theater opens up. It is at State and about 27th, 28th in Bronzeville. Why is this important? This is the first all African-American owned and operated theater in American history. And that is a big, big, big deal. Dr. Fannie Emanuel. I'm shocked by how not nearly enough people know about this woman. Chicago didn't invent social work, but we perfect, much like prostitution. Thank you. And of course, at the hub of Chicago social work and settlement houses, Jane Addams and the Hull House, right? How the Hull House was segregated. Fannie Emanuel, who had moved to Chicago, married a gentleman named Dr. Emanuel, and while she was studying for her own medical degree, helped him to run a chiropractic clinic in downtown Chicago. While studying to be a doctor in her own right, and she saw the need for an integrated settlement house. So she opened the first integrated settlement house in the American experience, Dr. Fannie Emanuel, and then after it closed down because they didn't need it anymore, she got her medical degree and her letters and so forth and treated people presumably until she couldn't anymore. Dr. Fannie Emanuel, and she's got on her cap and gown and everything there too, which is very positive that she at least went to grammar school. 1910, Mr. Jack Johnson takes on the whole world and knocks it in the mouth, hits it in the mouth and wins the, heavyweight championship of the world, the first person of color to do so. And he was up against something. So this country boy from Texas wins the most prestigious sports title in the world. And what does he do? He moves to Chicago. He moves to Bronzeville. Not only does he move to Bronzeville, but he opens up his own restaurant. Le Café des Champions, Jack Johnson's joint, otherwise known. Not only does he do that, he personally integrates the Everlake. For those of you who know what the Everlake Club was, you're welcome. For those of you who don't, I can't talk about such things like that. But Jack Johnson, the first of our the Everlake Club was the most famous brothel in the world. And they were segregated until Jack Johnson showed up. And you want to tell him that he can't be served there, and he was served there. So that is enough of that. You can't tell, but I'm blushing right now. Jack Johnson, the first of our triumvirate, hey bud, the first of our triumvirate of heavyweight champions. Now, at this point in the 20th century, the African American experience in many ways is so mirroring the larger American experience as far as middle class, this, that, and everything. And this is typified by things like Black sororities, Black fraternities, and so forth, Black lodges, the Elks Club, the Mooses, the Raccoons, the Water Buffaloes, Redford and Stone, all of those things. I want you to look at this. Now, here's some more duality here. This is an angel, devil kind of a thing. The Elks, welcome, Keenan Jones. Mr. Jones, would you like to say a few words? Yes, I would. Doesn't my mustache look handsome? Don't I have a cool Hamburg on? Now, by day, I'm known as a restaurateur and an entrepreneur, and any other words that rhyme with "ur." But by night, sorry, I haven't had much to eat today. By night, this gentleman was one of the founders of Southside Policy. That is illegal racketeering, primarily in this country, by African American. The numbers. That's absolutely right. And this man was a genius, so much so that Al Capone and Machine Gun Jack McGurn in the 1920s approached him and said, listen, don't worry, we're not going to wipe you out like we could if we wanted to. But you take care of colored Chicago, we'll take care of the rest of it. And this not only saved them, but it endeared Al Capone to Black people for forever. It wasn't until Sam Giancana took over the Italian gang where he waged a holy war, if you will, on the racketeers from the South Side, wiping them out and absorbing their business under their umbrella. However, we still have the trappings and the residue of that. Every time you see somebody play a lottery game in this country of ours, it is based on the numbers as created by the racketeers on the South Side of Chicago, in Harlem, and in Pittsburgh. So there you go.
Yeah.
Yes, Robert Abbott. So he comes back to Chicago and he says, you know, I'm not really a singer anymore. I've been spoken too much. Paper man. And so he goes to his landlady and says, Mrs. Landlady, I want to start a weekly newsletter. She says, you go ahead, Robert. And so he starts a weekly newsletter on her kitchen table. And the circulation is great and it's popular. It becomes a daily newsletter and then a daily newspaper. And this, of course, is called the Chicago Defender. Now, the Chicago Defender, in and of itself and by itself, is already worthy of all kinds of mentions. But there's so much that stem from Mr. Abbott and the Defender. So how did Mr. Abbott grow this newspaper? I'm glad you asked me. I'll tell you. He saw an opportunity within the city limits. The Pullman Porters and the Pullman maids going all over the United States, headquartered in Chicago. He approached all of them and he said, listen, here's a stack of my newsletters, sell them, bring me back 60%, y'all keep the other 40. And so as a result, this was the first African-American publication to enjoy a nationwide circulation. And then the Pullman Porters themselves, this job and the maids was one of the first jobs in the African-American experience that could help you get a leg up to being middle class without the benefit of a college degree. A very, very good thing. Yeah. 10,000 black men, all named George, as the expression went. And you see them depicted in movies and in TV shows and so forth. And you gotta think, oh man, I'm not strong enough to have dealt with this. I would have been fired or in prison the first day. But I wouldn't have made it through the first shift before I smacked somebody in the mouth or called somebody something accidentally, intentionally under my breath. These guys so learned how to just let stuff go in one ear and out. And these jobs were coveted. Many men and women who had college degrees worked as Pullman porters and Pullman maids because the money was so good. And money talks, nonsense walks in this country. So all of this is going on and the Jim Crow fires are blazing even more as far as trying to control us. But something interesting happens. We have this accidental conspiracy, if you will, or a confluence of two things coming together. Jim Crow gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the Great Northern Drive begins as a trickle. And you have many influential people in the North encouraging African Americans, hey, move up to the North because you're just going to get lynched hanging around there. And if you hang around Clarence Goodman at all, you're going to get thrown under the jail at some point. The Great Northern Drive begins, but then a couple of things happen. The Great Migration really becomes the Great Migration in earnest during World War I. This confluence of not only Jim Crow, but the destruction of many of the cash crops still left in the South by boll weevil epidemic makes the people in the South, the white supremacists and the KKK people go crazy and try to keep the indentured servants and the sharecroppers and so forth chained even more to the land. So anybody with a microphone in the North, hello, out there, hi. If you're listening to this broadcast down in the South, pack up everything you can in a suitcase, jump on the first thing smoking and come north. We'll give you a map. There's the map. So the Great Migration in its real soup periods, all of these veins heading out to the West Coast, heading to the Northeast. Then, of course, the two cities the most greatly affected by the Great Migration, Detroit and Chicago, US of A. In 1910, when it was just the Great Northern Trickle, we made up roughly 2% of the population of Chicago. And this was at a time when there were 1,700,000 people, not many. Before my arrival in this world, by 1960, we made up 25% of Chicago. And by this point, the city of Chicago's population was close to 3.5 million people. Y'all do the math, too tired. So, of course, as the great Nina Simone and Langston Hughes were writing one of their songs, Mr. Backlash, what are you gonna do? Every time we have some sort of progress in this country with regard to race or gender or sexual identity, religion, anything, there is a backlash. And one of the biggest backlashes of the 20th century anyway was Red Summer, the summer of 1919, race riots all over the place. One of the biggest ones, of course, in Chicago, the race riot of 1919, which resulted in more than 50 people dying and millions and millions and millions of dollars in property damage and loss. It was so bad, the Union Stockyard closed for 2 weeks.
Whoa.
Damn. Yeah, that is really, really something. And once again, I'm gonna just by show of hands, how many of you heard of the race riot of 1919 before? 1, 2, 3. Most of you have. That's good. You're too young. Go do your homework. I'm just kidding. Yes.
I find it interesting that Corbin, Kentucky had a race riot and me and Donna were born in Corbin, but not in 19.
Get out. I know you're old, but you're not that.
No. Well before our time.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing. Everybody thinks that their town is free of
Oh, no.
all kinds of things. No, y'all don't, because I know y'all, but most Americans think that their town, their school, their everything, the people, their family. Oh, my family's wonderful. My friends are wonderful. Then you get older and you're like, oh, did that happen? Oh, did he say that at that party?
Yeah, yeah.
Ooh, that guy's the president. He said that? Oh, my goodness gracious. He should be put in jail. So this is one of our first big backlashes when it comes to the Jim Crow era and the post-slavery era. But be very clear. It was always going on in Chicago, and in many ways it still goes on. From July 1st, 1917 to March of 1921, a Black occupied residence or owned business in Chicago was blocked every 23 days.
Wow.
Yes, wow indeed. And this is one of those things that gets nicely swept under the rug when Chicago, for the last 150 years, has been portrayed as this racial Shangri-La and all this other owl nonsense, talking to the owl. And this leads to this gentleman. This is a newspaper man by the name of Mr. Claude Barnett. Why is he on here? Because nobody was hearing about the backlash and nobody was hearing about all of this murder and all of this bombing that was going on against people by virtue of their race. He said, wow, the National Wire Service is white-owned, white-oriented, and they marginalize everything that's not part of the WASP script. So he starts the first Afrocentric newspaper wire service, the Negro Associated Press, in 1919, Mr. Claude Barnett. Now, everybody here in this room, maybe with the exception of Zeal, has had a Saturday morning ruined by their parents at Sears Roebuck. Before there was Amazon, there was Sears. And the Sears company, let's be very, very clear, everybody who ever owned Sears were the biggest liberal, progressive people ever. However, they had no idea that their greatest shot in the arm when it came to dignity and human relations and so forth, Sears cattle.
Yeah.
The Sears cattle. I want you, you're all women here, so I want you to pretend that you're me for just a minute. How is it? When I first moved to the suburbs in 1973, and I first went out with my friends, my mother said to me, don't put your hands in your pockets, keep your head up, and don't look suspicious, because these white people are looking to pin something on you. I'm like, damn, I mean, oops, excuse me, Al, Mom, what are you talking about? She said, this is how it's been forever. And so I'm imagining, this was me in the 1970s in the second biggest city in the United States. Imagine what it was like for African Americans living in Richmond and Atlanta and in Macon, Georgia and Memphis and so forth before World War II. before World War One. Every time you're going into town, somebody's gonna give you a hard time and you might get lynched. Wait a minute, I don't have to go downtown and deal with Mr. Charlie or Mrs. Charlotte, whatever. I can take the Sears catalog and I can order anything from a toothbrush to a prefabricated house. And so very, very quietly, the Sears catalog becomes an avenue of circumvention when it comes to Jim Crow and maybe getting lynched for being accused of ripping off something. Anyway, 1928, the Regal Theater opens on South Park in Chicago. South Park will, of course, be renamed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. But this is important because the Regal Theater opens up there. It opens up at between 48th and 47th on King Drive now. And the Regal Theater was Chicago's answer to the Apollo. Is that out there or is that out here? He's probably watching this on Zoom and he was driven to tears. Yeah, he was that weird. Yeah, the Regal Theater opens up and this is Chicago's answer to the Apollo Club. That's a really, really big deal. Everybody who was anybody until this theater closed, I believe in the late 1970s, coming through Chicago, this is where you played. The list is ridiculous. It's like opening a chapter of the Old Testament, the list of legendary people, just like it, the book of the Regal Theater. One day, but my favorite anecdote that I've heard about the Regal Theater, there was this family group coming through there, and they were doing a gig, 1965, and they were tinkering with their name. And they decided to try the name Jackson 5 the first time. So that is where the name Jackson, boy, that guy's getting some mileage with mom. They're getting their steps in. We could have used him to schlep the furniture around here. Pilgrim Baptist Church, baby. This former synagogue is sold to Baptist interests in 1931, I believe, and then 1933. Good preacher by the name of Reverend Thomas A. Dorsey is crafting a new genre of music that will be a little bit traditional, spiritual, a little bit of this is going to swing, and it's going to have beautiful harmonies. And of course, he basically invents gospel music on the south side of Chicago, 33rd in Indiana. Let me back that up if I can back this up. Yes, that building is still there. It is completely gutted, and the church has moved across the street. Do you want to know why it's becoming the, I'm sorry? No, it was intentionally done. Believe it or not, Chicago, you figure fire's going to start in a minute. No, it's being converted to the National Gospel Music Hall of Fame and Museum. That is awesome and wow. And of course, one of the charter entries that will be these two people on this page here. Obviously, Reverend Thomas A. Dorsey's muse was the God that he worshiped, but his songbird and his mouthpiece, for obvious reasons, Mahalia Jackson coming up to Chicago through the Great Migration. But wait a minute. Here is the most important person to ever play gospel music, and I say that incredibly biased. She's important, not the most famous, but Sister Rosetta Tharpe dragged gospel music into the mainstream. She set the precedent for the person who by day played all, or I should say during the week or on Sundays, played all of these sacred songs, and then by night shut up and played the blues. And you are looking at perhaps the most important guitarist ever born in the United States. This woman influenced everybody in Britain and every guitarist in America born around World War II and since. And this includes the Beatles, all of those British cats. She is something else, and she is a charter member of the Dimples Hall of Fame, as you can plainly see. And if you've never heard of her, and you've never heard her play, go to YouTube, pull her up. She sang like an angel, and then at the same time, she's playing the guitar like a demon. Sister Rosetta Tharpe comes to Chicago. Oh, and she was one of those child prodigies. She could play any instrument at 4 years old. So mother and father, who were both preachers, had to make some money off. Shocking. That's the first time someone of the cloth tried to get rich on someone. It's a shame. My man here, who's this man? I don't know. That's not important. What's important is my man is playing a K guitar made in Chicago to remind me to tell you that Chicago was the biggest producer of inexpensive but very, very good musical instruments for about 75 years. I used to have a collection of K guitars. This is to remind me to tell you about another genre of music that comes alive in Chicago. Rent parties were all the rage before World War II and after. And a new kind of music was being crafted to play at rent parties. And it was a combination of folk and blues and a little jazz, but it was designed to get people dancing and drinking. So they would have to dancing, sweating, so they get winded and sweaty and have to buy drinks. This was called skiffle music. Skiffle music, a lot of train songs born in Chicago in the latter part of the 1920s, goes east, goes over the pond, is anglicized, and once again, like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, influences all of those early rock guys, most notably the Beatles. So that Chicago ain't got no Beatles. Love me don't. Yeah, my man here, another blues musician. I wish I had a hat like this. This man comes to Chicago during the Great Migration, Delta blues musician, and he hears, hey, the wonderful Jewish shop owners have this open air market called Maxwell Street. They hire people. My man goes down there, plays blues outside all day. His once beautiful voice now like this. Oh no, I've been singing outside all day. What do? You're in Chicago. You go to Sears, you go to Monkey Ward, you go anywhere, you get a cheap electric guitar. And you get a cheap microphone, and you get a cheap amplifier. You plug all those bad boys and bad girls in, and you start to scream those same blues over those changes, and you invent Chicago blues. Chicago blues invented out of necessity and the marriage of electricity. Yes, electricity to Delta blues. I'm sorry, I'm cracking myself up here. Escapism. Speaking of escapism, now Bessie Coleman, I've been researching her and she was some kind of something. She is absolutely justifiably credited for being one of the great pioneers in women's aviation. But she did not fall out of her crib one day and say, I want to fly. Look at those birds. I want to fly. She was looking to get famous and she kept trying all of these things. And then the African-American friends and relations of hers coming back from France after World War I said, y'all Chicago women are basic. Y'all need to be more like these people over in France. They look at us as people, not black people. And she said, So she started to do some digging around. Oh my goodness, flying. Maybe that's how I can get paid. And she did. Who cares? She went on to inspire people, and it is just so poignant that both she and another Chicagoan you might have heard of by the name of Amelia Earhart, both pioneers, both died pursuing this passion or device, depending on who you're talking to. Before there was Spike Lee, there was Oscar Micheaux. Really? Yes, there was. During the silent film era, before there was Hollywood, Chicago, USA, the capital of the silent film industry, and one of the earliest ones was this man here. You're looking at a college rivalry of the Ohio State University and Marquette University, University of Marquette. You have on the left, Mr. Jesse Owens, and on the right, Mr. Ralph Metcalf. This is them in the, pardon? Oh, I got it. This is them in the early 1930s, just running in a track meet. And Mr. Metcalf edges out Mr. Owens here. Wow. A few years later, they would be teammates on the 1936 Olympic team, which would reward both of them with gold medals. In the case of Mr. Owens, 4 gold medals and legendary status. Mr. Metcalf, only one smart dude. He took that out on a speaking tour, basically, came to Chicago and parlayed his fame into a political career. Of course he did. If you're in Cook County, you're going to run for office at some point. And as a result, he becomes the first prominent Black politician in Chicago history. If you've ever been to the junction of Jackson and Clark, the beginning of the Federal Plaza, the first building you see bears his name, the Ralph Metcalf Building. Are you ready for some football? Probably not. However, the first Black QB was this man, a Chicago fellow in the NFL, a Chicago fellow by the name of Fritz Pollard. And he also, when his coach got thrown out of a game, he became head coach for a couple of games. Oh, a Chicago kid from around the turn of the last century, the first Black head coach in NFL history. And that's perfect because the NFL was effectively invented by Chicago. The Brown Bomber, the man so closely associated with New York and Harlem, long after he had retired. He moves to Chicago after his career is over because Chicago was growing. From 1933 to about 1955 or so was the Chicago Black Renaissance specifically, and the Chicago Renaissance in general. And everybody who had money and could do it was moving to Chicago. So Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, moved to Chicago to have some fun and to make a little bit more of that money. The second of our heavyweight triumvirate. Around that same time. How's everybody doing? We got about 10 minutes left. Everybody good?
Great.
Excellent. Meet Lloyd Albert White. His work as a physicist and an engineer took him to the south side of Chicago, to the campus of the University of Chicago to teach. No. A little project called the Manhattan Project.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, the University of Chicago Maroons had surrendered their football team and their stadium for the Manhattan Project, which of course resulted in, well, the nuclear age eventually, but this gentleman was involved with this. Now, you're looking at the second greatest quartet of musicians ever, after only the Beatles. This, my friends, Benny Goodman's quartet, throwing down all the time around Chicago and all around the United States. Now, the two white gentlemen, they're with the licorice stick, as they're known, the clarinet, that's BG, Benny Goodman, the man on the drums, another cat from Chicago by the name of Gene Krupa. Very good. We know our big band and so forth. All righty, ma'am, for $100 that my friends here will pay you, who's sitting at the piano?
Yeah. Oh.
Teddy Wilson. Who is at the vibes? Lionel Hammond. This was Benny Goodman's favorite band and his favorite quartet, and these cats played all over the place. But shockingly, jazz music was segregated. Black musicians could not play on the same stage with white musicians, and don't get me started about people dancing in the audience. Benny Goodman had enough of this nonsense. And so, in addition to his quartet and his small ensembles, he had a regular gig with his big band, dance band, at the Congress Plaza Hotel every Sunday. 1936, it just happened to be Easter. He says, you know what, I've had enough of this nonsense. And he tells Teddy Wilson, Ted, slide on down. I doubt if he said slide. Ted, take a streetcar downtown and sneak in this side door, sneak up on the bandstand, and just start. And well, hopefully the city of Chicago won't burn down again. So very, very quietly, Teddy Wilson becomes the Jackie Robinson of jazz music on Easter Sunday, 1936. And it don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. John H. Johnson tried to swing it a little differently. John H. Johnson, in his words, said, he was a newspaper man, a publishing man, he wanted to be the Negro Hugh Hefner. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that he wants to have orgies all of the time in his basement? Or does it mean that he wants to open up a magazine publishing empire? Hopefully the latter and rather the former. And indeed, in pursuit of that, while Hugh Hefner had all of his shenanigans and publications going on North Michigan Avenue, on South Michigan Avenue, Mr. John H. Johnson enjoyed popularity with his first publication, the Negro Digest. It was so popular, he split it off into two publications, Ebony and Jet. And as a result, you're looking at the first high-rise office building in America, designed by an African-American architect, Mr. John Mochesami. This building, though ebony nor jet have not been there in forever, this is a national landmark, and it is part of Columbia College now. But you walking down Michigan Avenue, you can look up there and see that. And if you are of a certain age, your bosom can swell with pride. And if you're me, my hockey nickname was the Ebony Jet. That is absolutely true. That's true. One timer, yes. Oh, what a buzzkill. 1955, this boy goes to see his people in Mississippi, and he never comes back except all mangled up in a pine box. And of course, we're talking about a kid from the south side of Chicago by the name of Emmett Till. A couple of my aunts and uncles who are no longer with us knew him, and when he got murdered, it sent shockwaves that they couldn't describe to me decades later, but they all got a chill over them and were reluctant to talk about it and so forth. So Emmett Till, this man's murder, this man's lynching, this 14-year-old boy's lynching is the spark that really sets off the modern civil rights movement once the flames are blown and fanned months later by the Montgomery bus boycott. And this, of course, leads us to the incomparable Dr. Martin Luther King. So many Chicagoans have no idea that Doc was in Chicago all of the time. In his brief but profound career, he even moved to Chicago for more than a year in order to desegregate the North, the hypocritical North, in step with what he was trying to do in the American South. And of course, the city of Chicago. Malcolm X, this was really outside of New York City and Boston. This was Malcolm X's third home. He converted to Islam when he was in prison, and the headquarters was and still is in Chicago. And so he had been corresponding with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad long before he was released from prison. And so when he got out, he was ready, and he spent many times coming back to Chicago to whip the other ministers into shape. And then ultimately this divide that began really laid the foundation for his murder down the line. Now, towards the end of his life, when he knew he was going to be murdered by somebody, he did a tour where he spoke to as many members of the press and radio and TV as he could. You're looking at him being interviewed by one of his favorites, Chicagoan Irv Kupcinet. He would go on Irv Kupcinet's radio programs all the time. There's one of the last pictures taken of Malcolm X in Chicago, probably the last picture taken of him in Chicago. And of course, he was dead a couple of weeks later, murdered by members of the Nation of Islam in front of his wife and 4 of his 6 children. 2 of his children were in the stomach of his wife at the time. Meet Fred Hampton. If you've never heard of him, I want you to meet him, and I want you to read a book on him, and I want you to embrace the full impact and potential of what this man could have meant to all of us. This 20-year-old kid who was the leader of the Black Panther Party on the south side of Chicago had all kinds of stuff going on. Molasses as well as sulfur, if you can pardon me for using that expression. Yeah, he talked about being separate, and he talked about this, and he talked about being militaristic, but he also talked about free breakfast for underprivileged kids in the morning at school and things of this nature. What happened to him? The Chicago police murdered in his sleep when he was 20 years old. What potential were we robbed of? And this was 1969, just months after the incredibly chaotic Democratic convention in Chicago. And all of these things going on in Chicago typified not only that Mayor Daley had lost it, kind of, because we all lose it eventually, but more importantly, he had lost his grip on Chicago. But this led to the perfect climate for our first woman mayor, who was watching the swearing in of our first elected American mayor, the Honorable Jane Byrne and the Honorable Harold Washington, respectively there. Great time. Now, I thought, wait, this is great. We're going to have Black and women mayors every few minutes in Chicago. Well, it took the better part of 50 years. And we have to have one person both rolled into one. we have to have this both rolled into one, a woman and an African American and a lesbian, an open lesbian, all rolled into one. Damn, well, at least she's getting it done. She's rounding those bases and she's checking all of those boxes. Of course, the Honorable Lori Lightfoot and the Honorable Brandon Johnson, who is clearly the world's biggest Chicago Bears fan. The constellation of modern stars, we round third base and head towards home. Richard Wright. If you don't know his work, you're in a library, look him up, check him out. A writer of some of the definitive pieces of not just African-American literature, but American literature of the middle of the 20th century. Lorraine Hansberry. If you had a Mount Rushmore of playwrights who called Chicagoland home, David Mamet, you would have Sam Shepard, and you would undoubtedly have this woman here. She smiled like a baby, but she bit like a gator. Lorraine Hansberry. Oh, you are looking at Gwendolyn Brooks, who the first African-American recipient of the Pulitzer Prize and the first African-American writer as brought in by the Library of Congress to advise them on the Library of Congress. That is some kind of something. And boy, she looks like she's ready to tell somebody something. Glad you want to talk to me. And very, very quietly, my friends, one of the definitive novels of the American experience in the middle of the last century, Knock on Any Door. Many people were shocked to find that it was written by an African American in Chicago, because as you read it, it just feels like a great, well-crafted American novel, irrespective of who it's about or whom it was written by, who it was about and who it was written by. LT. And in the same family, Archibald Motley, a great and important portrait painter whose works hang in the Art Institute of Chicago. Same family. How about the Thanksgiving dinners around that Motley household? People bragging. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad changed the south side of Chicago forever when he moved the Nation of Islam in the 1950s to Chicago. Growing up on the south side of Chicago until 1973 and driving north on Stony Island Avenue and seeing the Muslim brothers and sisters coming out after church was an impressive sight, to say the least. I am ashamed that I never heard of Diane Nash until I heard President Obama talking about the speech. This woman was a pioneer of the modern civil rights movement, a 19-year-old kid living on the south side of Chicago who was every bit the leader, according to everybody who knew her and was alive at the time, every bit the leader as John Lewis, but she got marginalized by sexism. And to this day, she's very much alive. She doesn't do any interviews nor talk about it because she's still so mad about how society treated her, how the movement treated her, the hypocrisy. We're talking about advancement of people, but only men. The incomparable, some of you who laugh, sorry, Zoomland. The incomparable Nat King Cole, the man who, he is justifiably known as one of the greatest singers in American history, but listen to his trio play some jazz music. The Nat King Cole trio, my goodness gracious. Dinah Washington. Before she died at 33 years old, she was on her way to joining the pantheon that would go on to include Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan, the great Dinah Washington. Sam Cooke, an interesting cat. Maybe the most transcendent thing about Sam Cooke is the line of people at heaven trying to meet him to thank him for writing Change Is Good.
Yes.
The definitive civil rights song, cleverly disguised as an R&B song. Who else we got up here? Click, click. Oh,
Sorry.
no, that's okay. There we go. Q. Kid from Bronzeville, 39th and Prairie, I believe Quincy Jones was from, until Taylor Swift, the most decorated and recognized person when it came to the Grammy Award. Let you, his name was Milton Olive III. He was a soldier, or he wanted to be a soldier. He was just a good kid, an American kid. He wanted to be a soldier, and so he finally was able to enlist during the Vietnam War. And shortly after he got overseas, he threw his body on a live grenade, sacrificing his life for all the lives of all of his army buddies. And as a result, he was the first Black recipient of the charm. Yeah, see, the disingenuous charm. I've melted. It's all on the floor. Just kidding you. I'm just giving you this charm. It's just eternal. And think, Milton Olive III, the first African-American recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, albeit posthumously. Wendell Campbell, a prominent African-American architect, and along with John Motusami, from the Second School of Chicago Architecture, and these two gentlemen, along with a handful of other people, studied directly under Mies van der Rohe, which explains why every third building in downtown Chicago looks like it was designed by Mies van der Rohe. May Carroll Jemison. She's either ready for a Halloween costume party or she was an astronaut. Ding, ding, yes, she was an astronaut, but more than that, she was a Renaissance woman, a dancer, an actress, a model, but most importantly, a doctor, working to this day from the University of Chicago. Barbara Gordon Proctor. She was the first woman and person of color, so rolled into one, who was the vice president of the A&R department of a major record label, BJ Records in the South Loop area. And as such, the job she did there, she was able later on in life to be the first woman in American history to own her own advertising agency. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
My friends, a man who needs no introduction, the third of our heavyweight champion triumvirate. I saw him twice in person, once at a red light on Stony Island Avenue on the south side, and then my mother and I went to see him train for a fight when he was making, I don't know which comeback it was, but he was making a comeback, and this time the comeback resulted in him. I think it was the Foreman fight, the Rumble in the Jungle, that he was making a comeback for. Needless to say, it worked, and one of my cherished memories is being in the same room with Muhammad Ali. The man who wanted to bring you peace, love, and soul. Now, my friends, on three, everybody, I want you to say it with feeling. The soul. 1, 2, 3. The soul of the world. Yes, Don Cornelius wanted, he was just looking to get paid. He was not trying to change history. Old man was looking to get paid and come up with a Black American bandstand. The first year that the Soul Train was in production, it was filmed at the Board of Trade building in downtown Chicago. And then he sold it to syndication and moved to Los Angeles and died a very, very, very rich man. But he changed the world. And for many people, many African Americans, I'd never heard of Elton John or David Bowie. And then I saw them on the Soul Train. And David Bowie singing Fame. And anyway, it was so surreal. Couldn't have been skinnier. 5'10" and 135. Anyway, enough about me. The honor, Reverend Jesse Jackson. Now, this is a man of reinvention, to be sure. And this is a controversial man. I've met him twice. Once at Sears at 79th and 79th Street and Union, I think on the south side of Chicago. And then I met him at one of my cousin's funerals a couple of years ago. And the dude is something else. He has worn many hats. The most important hat, perhaps, that he wore was when he ran for president in the middle 80s, because he legitimized an African American from any aspect of the Black experience running for president. And I swear I saw him with a cowboy hat on, making a speech in front of a bunch of dudes in Nebraska. I thought I was hallucinating. Seriously. Cardinal Wilton Gregory, the first African-American cardinal ordained by the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, he's cute. And of course, he's from the south side of Chicago. If you've watched television, and that's all of you, this woman has messed up your lives. Meet Chandra Rhimes. She who's created the most popular shows, I dare say, of the last 20 years, going way, way back. What did I see of hers? I don't remember if I've seen any of her shows, but I hear they're really, really good and gripping and addictive. And I guess her latest hit is Richardson. Okay, there you go. Chandra Rhimes, the most powerful woman in, sorry?
The company's called Shondaland.
Shondaland. That much I know, because I think I read something on her. And speaking of television, who's this? Oprah Winfrey. Important, obviously, for a bunch of different reasons. But here's the thing when it comes to our timeline. She arrives in Chi-Town roughly 18 months before this guy. And she, when a dude who was trying to make it with her, dude who was trying to date her by the name of Roger Ebert, talked her into selling her show to syndication. This enabled her to open up her own studio. So she bought the old Armory, and Harpo Studio opens up at the easternmost gate, if you will, of the Madison and Washington Street corridor, which were torn up and dangerous when she moved to town. Wait a minute, what about the West? Michael Jordan's collective and individual brilliance with the Bulls enables the Bulls to get a new gym and the Blackhawks to get a new rink at the westernmost entryway to this corridor. And my friends, between Damon and Halsted Street, the CTA had to open up a new L stop in that area. It is now, you can't get a latte for cheaper than $10. I swear. That used to be, my grandpa would say, you never take a respectable woman over there, so I imagine you'll take off. Yeah, sounded rest in peace. But they changed the neighborhood. They changed how people see African Americans. And they changed how the face of Black people are used in advertisements and product design, packaging, and the like. Oprah has advertised and endorsed everything, but not as much stuff as Michael Jordan has. And now you don't even think it's a person of color. You don't even think that it's an interracial couple. You don't even think that it is a couple with an immigrant or someone born. You don't even think about those things anymore. And I maintain that that begins with Oprah and Michael Jordan. And when I think of images, I think of the great, great, great first family. And at the hub of that first family, of course, is the 44th president of the United States, a man whose only crime apparently was wearing a tan suit in the White House. And then, so did Presidents Reagan and Bush wear tan suits in the White House. So from that perspective, not even talking about politics, but I'm talking about being presidential, and I'm talking about being respectable, and I'm talking about him and his family respecting the office, respecting the building, and respecting other Americans, even if those Americans never voted for them. And when I think of this family, I think of the Wall of Respect, the first great, great, great transcendent mural in the town of Murals, Chicago, the city of murals. This was in Bronzeville, painted in 1961 and then added to it. And you see this imitated all over Chicago, in spite of the neighborhood, in spite of the ethnic background of the neighborhood and so forth. And you see so many Chicagoans saying, yeah, we're important too. Yeah, we have something to offer. You look around and there's so many murals that depict the great women of Chicago history and so forth and so many things. And this, my friends, reminds me of a quilt. Chicago, our city, our nation, remind me of a quilt, a piece of fabric, homemade, a mutt, if you will, where every fiber is just as important as the next one in spite of the color of hair, eye color, pigmentation, religion, sexual orientation, anything, and most importantly, all part of our shared American narrative. If you have enjoyed this, look for me on TV. I just got back from Hollywood, and boy, are my arms tired. I shot a third show for the History. Go ahead and laugh, Seal. Third show for the History Channel. I was there, and Dark Marbles are already in circulation, but presumably next autumn, History's Mysteries with Lawrence Fishburne will feature me looking silly and being very cartoonish, basically what I'm doing here. Also, to hear more, see some sights of Black Chicago, go to NBCChicago.com, enter Black history into the search engine, and you will see a 5-minute film of me giving a very, very brisk walking tour of Bronzeville because it was 0 out that day. And then also coming up very soon, a chapter in Chicago Stories coming up soon, hopefully will feature a whole bunch of smart people and me talking about Al Capone and the roaring 20s of Chicago. I want to give a shout of thanks, and I hope you do too, to my buddy Zeal here. And our buddy, the owl, soon to be found at a Goodwill or a Salvation Army near you, my book. Also, my friends, all kidding aside, thanks so much for coming along. Good night. May your God go with you. And we'll hang around for 5 seconds for questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.